A disaster of the worst kind. A mix of anger and sadness. I'll be honest, I couldn't bring myself to talk about it right after the game because, my friends, that combination of emotions is brutal. It was the moment the entire season collapsed in real time, right in front of everyone watching. A 23-10 loss that felt far heavier than the scoreboard, far heavier than a normal December road defeat. That game confirmed fears that had been ignored or quietly swept under the rug for weeks. The Detroit Lions didn't just lose to the Vikings, they were exposed in every possible way, and every detail of that game helps explain why, in practical terms, the season ended right there. Before we continue, if you follow this team, suffer along with it, and value honest analysis, please leave a like on the video. It helps the channel a lot. And even with all of this, Merry Christmas to you. It was yesterday, along with the game, I know. It wasn't the Christmas we wanted, nor the gift the fans deserved, but we're still here telling the truth as always. 6 turnovers. That number alone tells the story, but it still doesn't fully capture how ugly this was. This team came into the game on the verge of setting a franchise mark for ball security. Just 8 turnovers with 2 games left. Against Minnesota, everything unraveled. 2 interceptions by Jared Goff, 4 lost fumbles, snaps on the ground, chaos in the backfield. Nothing looked under control. Goff finished with a passer rating under 65, was forced off his spot all day, and never looked comfortable behind an offensive line that simply could not function as a unit. And that's where this game really begins. The offensive line, the foundation of everything the Lions have been built on the last few seasons, collapsed. No Frank Ragnow. Taylor Decker out with illness. Injuries stacked on top of injuries until the lineup featured players who were never supposed to be in those roles together. Protection broke down immediately. The pocket never settled. Runs had nowhere to go. There was no rhythm, no physical dominance, none of the identity that had defined this team at its best. Even so, the defense gave the Lions opportunities. Minnesota was starting a third-string quarterback. Max Brosmer threw for just 51 yards and completed 9 passes. Let that sink in. The Vikings had 3 net passing yards and still won by 13 points. That hasn't happened in the NFL since 1952. Detroit sacked Brosmer 7 times. They held Justin Jefferson to 4 catches for 30 yards on only 5 targets. On paper, that should be a winning formula every single time. But the Lions still lost, because football games are won at the line of scrimmage and through basic execution. The Vikings ran for 158 yards. A single jet sweep by Jordan Addison went for 65 yards and effectively ended the game. It wasn't a surprise play. It was something Detroit has struggled to stop for weeks. Motion, misdirection, edge discipline breaking down again. Kevin O'Connell knew exactly where to attack, and he did it when the Lions needed one stop to stay alive. Offensively, nothing worked consistently. Jahmyr Gibbs ran hard, but finished with just 41 yards and a costly fumble. David Montgomery fought through illness and tried to will the team forward late, but there was no space, no push, no breathing room. The Lions outgained Minnesota on the ground, but the yards meant nothing because they were constantly wiping themselves out with mistakes, drops, missed blocks, botched snaps. This wasn't bad luck, this was systemic breakdown. The most damning part is the context. Minnesota was missing starters everywhere. 3 starting offensive linemen, their top quarterbacks, key defenders, and still, Detroit was the team that looked overwhelmed, swept by the Vikings. 1-4 in the division, 3 straight losses, from preseason expectations of contention to last place in the NFC North, all before Week 18 even arrived. Dan Campbell admitted after the game that major decisions are coming. He's right. Some players likely wore a Lions uniform for the last time in Minnesota. Veterans who have been part of this run are nearing the end.
And yet, this isn't about blowing everything up. It's about acknowledging that this season failed, especially up front. The loss of Frank Ragnow changed everything. The lack of depth on both lines was exposed brutally once injuries piled up. When Detroit couldn't block or stop the run, everything else became irrelevant. This game felt like a flashback to the past, to versions of the Lions fans thought were gone for good. Not because of the record, but because of how it looked. Sloppy, overmatched, mentally shaken. A team that talked all offseason about being tougher and more prepared than everyone else was outworked by a Vikings team playing backups across the board. And that's the part that hurts the most, because it forces an uncomfortable question that goes beyond one bad night. Was this collapse inevitable once the margin for error disappeared, or did something deeper break inside this team over the last month of the season? What makes this moment so difficult to process is that it didn't arrive out of nowhere. The warning signs were there, quietly at first, then louder every week. Close games that stopped being controlled, protection that started cracking, a run defense that kept giving up chunk plays at the worst possible times. Against Minnesota, all of it converged into one complete breakdown, and once it started, there was no stopping it. This was a Lions team that looked exhausted, not just physically but structurally. By the fourth quarter, you could see it. The defensive line had no rotation left. Players were gassed. Aiden Hutchinson fought and finished with 2 sacks, pushing his season total to 13.5, but even that effort felt isolated. There was no depth behind him. Alam McNeil went out early and didn't register a tackle. Roy Lopez battled, but there was only so much he could do. When the Lions needed fresh bodies, there simply weren't any. The same problem existed on offense. The Lions have weapons. Amon-Ra St. Brown was reliable again. Sam Laporta, when healthy, is a difference maker. Jameson Williams brings speed that changes coverage. Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery are one of the better backfield duos in the league. Jared Goff, despite this nightmare performance, had another strong season overall. But football doesn't allow you to skip steps. None of that matters if the offensive line can't hold up. Multiple fumbles started with snaps hitting legs, timing being off, communication breaking down. Kingsley Igbenogson struggled in a situation he was never supposed to be in. Tate Ratledge, a rookie, was asked to handle responsibilities that would challenge even a veteran. Christian Mahogany fought through injury. Taylor Decker being out due to illness mattered more than many want to admit. This wasn't one weak link. This was a chain reaction caused by a lack of depth and stability. And that brings the conversation to the uncomfortable part Lions fans don't want to ignore anymore. The offseason decisions matter now. The confidence that the roster was good enough at key positions is being questioned. Not because the starters weren't talented, but because the drop-off behind them was severe. When injuries hit, Detroit didn't bend. They broke. This loss also forces reflection on coaching and adaptation. Dan Campbell is not suddenly a bad coach. This staff didn't forget how to prepare. But the way this team was calling plays felt like it was designed for last year's roster, not the one that actually took the field in Minnesota. Power football requires power personnel. When that disappears, adjustments must come faster. Minnesota adjusted. Detroit didn't. The result is a season that ends not with hope, but with evaluation. The Bears game now feels almost symbolic, an epilogue rather than a chapter. Resting players makes sense. Protecting health makes sense. But the real work begins immediately after the final whistle of Week 18. Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell know it. The locker room knows it. Fans feel it. This is not a teardown moment. It's a reset of priorities. The Lions don't need slogans. They don't need hype. They need reinforcements in the trenches. They need competition. They need depth that can survive a long season. The identity that brought this franchise back into relevance was built on physicality and execution. When those disappeared, everything else followed. What happened in Minnesota will sit with this fan base all offseason, because it wasn't just about missing the playoffs. It was about watching a team lose the very traits that defined it. The challenge now is proving that this was a lesson, not a regression. The hardest part for many fans to accept is that this wasn't about one position failing or one player having a bad night. This was organizational exposure. When the Lions lost control of the trenches, everything they had built their confidence on disappeared with it. The Vikings didn't win because they were explosive or creative offensively. They won because they understood exactly where Detroit was weakest and kept attacking it until the Lions had no answers left. Look at the contrast. Minnesota had a third-string quarterback who barely threw the ball. They accepted that reality and built a plan around it. Protect him, lean on the run game, force Detroit to overcommit, then strike once with motion and misdirection. That single Jordan Addison jet sweep didn't just score a touchdown, it highlighted weeks of film that showed Detroit struggling with eye discipline and edge control. This wasn't clever. It was basic football executed with confidence. Meanwhile, Detroit played like a team trying to be something it no longer had the personnel to support. Power runs on short yardage behind a line that couldn't generate push. Deep drops that required protection the line couldn't provide. Blitzes on defense that left running lanes exposed when they didn't land. It felt like stubbornness more than belief, and that's where criticism becomes fair. The turnover margin wasn't just bad luck. Pressure forces mistakes. Confusion creates hesitation. Hesitation leads to turnovers. Jared Goff didn't suddenly forget how to play quarterback. He was hit, hurried, and forced to throw without balance. Jahmyr Gibbs didn't suddenly forget ball security. He was trying to create yards where none existed. These things compound, and once the snowball starts rolling, stopping it becomes almost impossible. This is why the emotional reaction from fans feels so intense. Expectations changed. This franchise raised the bar over the last few seasons. Meaningful December football became the standard. Competing for the division wasn't a dream anymore, it was expected. So when the season ends before week 18, and it ends looking like this, it forces everyone to recalibrate. The most important takeaway isn't that the Lions are broken, it's that they are unfinished. Depth matters. Development matters. Adjustments matter. The margin between competing and collapsing in the NFL is thin, and Detroit found out exactly how thin it is once injuries and attrition set in. Good teams survive that stretch. Great teams are built to absorb it. There are still pillars here. This locker room hasn't lost its pride. The core talent hasn't disappeared. But pride alone doesn't block defensive linemen, and belief doesn't fill gaps on a depth chart. This offseason will be about honest evaluation, not comfort. About admitting where confidence crossed into complacency. About rebuilding the foundation so that one injury doesn't unravel an entire unit. Minnesota didn't just beat Detroit. They showed them a mirror. They showed what discipline, adaptability, and trench control look like even with limited talent. That's the lesson that must stick, because if it doesn't, this won't be the last time a season ends this way. Now it's on the Lions to respond the only way that matters, not with words, but with actions. Roster construction, competition, accountability. That's how trust with the fan base is rebuilt. There's also a psychological layer to this collapse that can't be ignored. When a team's identity is built on toughness, on winning the ugly moments, the second that foundation cracks, doubt creeps in fast. You could see it on the field in Minnesota. After the early turnovers, after the first blown assignments, the body language changed. Drives started tight. Defenders hesitated instead of attacking. The Lions weren't playing free, they were playing careful, and that's when mistakes multiply. This is where leadership is tested the most, not when everything is rolling, but when adversity strips away confidence. Veterans are supposed to stabilize those moments, yet many of the veterans were either unavailable, injured, or physically limited. Younger players were forced into leadership situations before they were ready. That's not an excuse, but it is reality. Championship-level rosters are built so that injuries hurt, but don't paralyze the system. Detroit learned the hard way that they weren't there yet. Another uncomfortable truth is that the league adjusted, and Detroit didn't counter quickly enough. Defenses stopped respecting the interior run game because they knew the offensive line couldn't consistently win up front. Blitzes became more aggressive because teams trusted that pressure would get home. On defense, opponents leaned into motion and misdirection because Detroit struggled to communicate through it. None of this is secret anymore. Every coaching staff has the tape. That's why this offseason will define the next phase of this rebuild more than any other. The easy part was changing culture. The hard part is sustaining success once expectations rise. That's where many teams fail. The Lions now sit at that crossroads. Either this season becomes a painful but necessary step forward, or it becomes the moment where momentum quietly slips away. The most frustrating part for fans is knowing how close this team actually is. The Lions didn't lose because they lacked star power. They lost because football is still a game of fundamentals. Blocking, tackling, ball security, depth. When those disappear, the margin for creativity vanishes too. Minnesota didn't out-talent Detroit. They out-executed them. What comes next won't be solved in one draft pick or one free agent signing. It will be solved by acknowledging that the roster needs to be built to survive December, not just dominate September. By accepting that physical football requires physical backups. By understanding that adaptability is just as important as identity. This loss will sting for a long time because it stripped away illusions. It forced honesty. And honesty, while painful, is the only place real progress starts. Now it's your turn. How do you interpret what this collapse truly means for the future of the Detroit Lions? And what do you believe absolutely has to change so this never happens again? There is also a responsibility element that quietly hangs over this moment, one that doesn't always show up in box scores or injury reports. When a team spends multiple seasons talking about grit, toughness, and being built for December, those words eventually demand proof. Against Minnesota, the Lions didn't fail because they lacked effort. They failed because effort alone couldn't cover structural flaws. And that distinction matters, because it changes how the solution must be approached. Effort is easy to praise and just as easy to replace. Structure is not. Structure requires planning 2 and 3 seasons ahead, not just trusting that the starters will stay healthy or that scheme alone can overcome attrition. This game made it painfully clear that once Detroit lost its center of gravity up front, the entire operation tilted. Communication suffered, timing suffered, confidence followed right behind. It also reframes how fans should look back on the season as a whole. There were wins that masked these problems early. Games where explosive plays or timely turnovers covered for inconsistent line play. Moments where the Lions escaped rather than dominated. Those were signs, even if they didn't feel urgent at the time. December as a way of collecting all those unpaid debts at once. What's sobering is that this wasn't a loss to an elite quarterback or a high-powered offense. It was a loss to a team that simplified the game and trusted fundamentals. Minnesota didn't need to be perfect. They needed to be disciplined. Detroit, meanwhile, needed to be flawless just to survive, and that's not a sustainable way to win in the NFL. This is why the reaction from Dan Campbell after the game matters. Acknowledging that hard decisions are coming is the first step, not deflecting, not sugarcoating, not hiding behind injuries. The best organizations don't wait for excuses to expire, they confront them immediately. Whether that urgency translates into roster changes, philosophical adjustments, or renewed competition will define what the Lions look like a year from now. Fans aren't asking for miracles, they're asking for clarity. They want to know that this collapse won't be dismissed as bad luck or a fluke. They want to see lessons turned into action. They want to believe that when the next December arrives, this team won't crumble the moment things stop going perfectly. Because what happened in Minnesota wasn't just a bad day, it was a stress test, and the Lions didn't pass it. The question now isn't whether this roster has talent, it's whether the organization has the willingness to evolve before the same weaknesses are exposed all over again. Another layer that fans are starting to wrestle with is accountability versus continuity. This staff and front office earned trust over the last few seasons by pulling the franchise out of irrelevance. That matters, but trust doesn't mean immunity from scrutiny. What Minnesota exposed wasn't a lack of heart, it was a lack of insulation. When things went wrong, there was nothing underneath to catch the fall. That's a roster-building issue, not a motivational one. The NFL is ruthless in that way. It doesn't care about how close you were last year or how good the story sounded in October. December football is about redundancy. Can you lose a starter and still function? Can you survive injuries without abandoning who you are? Against the Vikings, the answer was no. Once the Lions were forced to play Plan B, they didn't have one. That's why the conversation about bad luck feels hollow. Injuries happen to every team. Minnesota proved that in the same game, playing without their quarterback room, multiple linemen, and key